Achieving cinematic visuals in 3D rendering was always a valuable skill, which often presented the credibility of the artist and his ability to create aesthetic renders. In this video I'm gonna show you how I used the full power of the Blender Compositor as a post-processing tool to make my renders look more cinematic, crisp and generally more visually appealing. So let's begin. Now before we start with the composing process, there are a couple of things that we need to do first. First, let's go to the render properties and let's scroll all the way down to the color management section and make sure that the view transform that you are using is set to AGX. It should be set by default because it's the most recent view transform that was added to Blender. However, I'm just saying this because you will have the best results when you use this specific view transform. Also, if you want to check if your scene is properly exposed, you can switch the transform to the false color, which will basically show you the levels of exposure of different areas to light. The colors that you mostly want in your renders are usually green, blue, a little bit yellow, and just a little bit of orange or red, which basically means that the area is overexposed. But this doesn't really matter because this naturally happens with most cameras, and it can also be fixed to a certain degree with the composing. But if you feel like the scene is not exposed enough or it's overexposed, you can play with this exposure setting and basically shift the illumination. Also check if all the objects that you have in the scene are enabled in the render, which you can basically tell by looking at this icon. If the toggle is off, it will mean that the collection or the object will be disabled from the render, so you need to make sure that all these objects and the collections are basically turned on. Lastly, go to the view layers and make sure that the denoising data is enabled. This is very helpful because this way we can actually use specific data for the denoising, so the denoising will be more accurate. The next step is rendering the scene, so you just press render and you will wait until the scene is fully rendered. After the scene is rendered, we can go to the compositor and make sure that the use nodes is enabled because we'll be using nodes. You can see that we have this render layer node. This node basically contains all the outputs, but right now we are specifically interested in the denoising data, since we need to denoise the image first. So let's add the denoise node, and let's connect the noise image to the image, the denoising normal to normal, and the albedo to albedo. So with this node we basically get rid of the remaining noise in the image, and you can see that the result is basically unnoticeable. There are basically no changes, the image looks basically the same, and this is only because I used a lot of samples, because I'm using volumetrics for the cloud, which usually needs a lot of samples to actually be rendered without the noise. But if you're gonna use the denoise node, you can render the scene with very low samples. And just to be clear, the denoising should be the very first operation that you do to your render before all the other nodes, because now we can work with a clean image. Now let's add exposure, because I want to make the earth a little bit more exposed and a little bit brighter, so let's set the exposure to 0.1. Just to make the image a little bit brighter, the next node that we'll be adding is a gamma node. So let's add gamma. Let's plug it to the node 3 and let's increase the gamma to 1.1. And what this node does is that it basically takes the midtone range, and when you increase the gamma it will basically shift it a little bit towards the shadow, which means that the midtones will be a little bit darker. If I increase the gamma to something like 0.9, you can see that the midtones will become a little bit brighter because the gamma node is shifting the midtones a little bit towards the highlights. But we want the exact opposite, so let's set it to 1.1. And now this is where the fun begins, because the next node that we'll be adding is a color balance node. This node is primarily used for color grading, where you can change the tone for highlights, midtones and shadows separately. So first we need to change the correction formula to offset power slope. Now the only color that I'm gonna change is the slope color, which will basically affect the highlights. So I want to set the highlight color to a little bit green, but also a little bit blue. So let's put it somewhere in between. And you can see that now we have this a little bit more greenish and bluish tint, which in my opinion it makes a little bit more spacey. But I think I increased the saturation too much, so I'm gonna decrease the saturation just a little bit. Now I would like to decrease the contrast between the midtones and the highlights. So what I can do is that I can increase the power of the offset to 1.2 and I can decrease the power to 0.8. This will make the image a little bit darker, but don't worry because we are going to fix this later. For now let's add RGB curves, and this is where we are going to create that cinematic look. So switch to film like, I'm gonna use something which is called S-curve, which is used a lot in cinematography and photography. It will basically boost the mid highlights and the mid shadows, which creates a little bit bigger contrast, but at the same time it will not affect the highlights and the shadows at all. So let's add one dot here and one dot here, and let's bring this dot a little bit up to the highlights, and let's bring the second dot a little bit towards the shadows. As you can see, this is why it's called the S-curve, because it has this S shape. And one more thing that I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna take this dot and I'm gonna bring it a little bit up, so it's not a pure black. And I'm gonna do the same thing for the white. So let's bring the highlights a little bit down as well. And this is basically the result after applying the S-curve. You can see that this is before and this is after. It's still a little bit dark, so we can fix this by adding brightness and contrast node. So let's add brightness contrast node, and let's plug it to node 3, and let's set the brightness to 1. Now this node is not mandatory for everybody, but if you want to add a little bit more detail to your render, you can add diamond sharpen node, which is a classic sharpening filter which almost every single editing software has. However, the factor of 1 is a little bit overkill, so I'm gonna set the factor to 0.2. Now it's time to add the glare. So let's add the glare node. This node basically simulates that lens flare, which often occurs when you point your camera to a very bright object, like a sun or a lamp, or basically any bright object which exceeds the dynamic range of the camera, which is basically a range between the darkest and the brightest point, which the sensor can capture. And this is the result that comes with the photo. Now here you can choose from different types of glare. Since I'm rendering Earth, I would like to add that Earth atmosphere blue glowing effect, which basically makes Earth look like Earth. So let's set the glare type to fog glow. Let's go to highlights and let's decrease the threshold to 0.1, and let's change the tints to blue. Here you can see the before and after applying the glare, and you can clearly see that with the glare it just looks better. I'm gonna also increase the size, and let's change the quality to high. Now I'm gonna also duplicate the glare, and I'm gonna use one more glare, but this time I'm gonna use the ghost glare, which is a little bit different type of glare, which I personally like, but you can use whatever glare you want. I'm gonna change the iterations to 2, the color modulation to 0.5, and the threshold to something like 0.25. Now we are almost done, but the last node that we are missing is the distortion node. When you capture a photo, there is almost always a little bit level of distortion in the corners. You can mostly find it on photos that were taken with older cameras, but some modern cameras have this as well, primarily because of the curved lens. So let's add lens distortion, and let's set the distortion to some small number, because I don't want the distortion to completely distort my image. So let's set it to -0.001. Another artifact that you can mimic with the lens distortion node is that you can increase the dispersion, which is an effect that is also very common among older images, where especially in the corners of the image, the image is separated into RGB channels. It's such an easy way how you can add realism to your renders. So just set the dispersion to something like 0.1. You can see that the effect is working just by looking in the corner of the image, where the areas that are closer to the corner or to the edge of the image are getting more and more stretched. You can also see the RGB separation of the individual channels, which is also gradually increasing when you go to the edge of the image. And this is the end of my video. I hope you learned something about creating cinematic shots in Blender. And if you did find this video valuable, all you need to do is to subscribe to my YouTube channel to see more videos like this. I also just recently created my first add-on that contains over 100 procedural materials that you can easily apply and edit without leaving 3D viewport. So if you want to check that out, it is the first link in the description. With that being said, that's all from me, and I'm gonna see you in the next video. See ya.